Okay, good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us for our daily shir in Likutei Moharan. Like we mentioned at the end of yesterday's shir, we had the tremendous hashgacha of Hashem arranging that we should be up to Rebbe Nachman's Purim lesson, Erev Purim, which is I think astounding. Really, Vateim Kol Shir. Nice. Everybody's just astounded over this incredible fact that here we are. You know, it's only fitting. We're heading up to Purim, and here we are at Torah Yud, which, like I said, is unequivocally Rebbe Nachman's Purim lesson. With Hashem's help, we're going to try to get through as much as we can before Purim, and we'll see about Purim morning whether there'll be shir. Someone reminded me that into Shabbos enables the people who probably won't have a chance to listen to the recording to listen on Sunday. And I'm open to it, so we'll discuss that. Okay, but let's jump into it. Says the Heilige Rebbe Schusia Gnaleinu. Torah Yud ve'ela mishpatim asher tasam lefneihem. These are the mishpatim, which oftentimes Parshas Mishpatim, at least in certain years, is falling around certainly around Adar or Purim time. Asher tasam lefneihem, that you shall place before them. This is a pasuk that we've already learned in the context of Rebbe Nachman's Torahs in Torah Zayin. Was also started with that very same pasuk and a comment on that very same pasuk. Now, there's just a little bit of background. If you're learning Be'iyun, not every single, but many of the Torahs, many of the lessons have like an anecdote that's connected to them in Chayei Moharan that tells the circumstances in which are around the Torah, how it was said and what it was about, and it usually incorporated different elements that were taking place in the lives of the Hasidim or dreams that they had. And every Torah basically is born out of a circumstance, out of current events, different things going on in the world. And so this, just anecdotally, I think it's important. Rebbe Nachman tells us in Sichas Ran that Rebbe Nachman preempted the beginning of this teaching by saying there are currently a lot of terrible gezeros that are being decreed against Klal Yisrael there in Ukraine. And the history is not so simple over there with the Jews, with the Yidden. And let's just try to be careful with the table. They're very shaky and the camera's on it. And he said, but now we're coming up to Purim, and Klal Yisrael are going to do a lot of dancing and clapping over Purim, and through the dancing and clapping, it's going to be mevatel the gezerah. It's going to annul the decree. And here we begin with that background. Says the Heilige Rebbe Schusia Gnaleinu, Kishiyesh chas v'shalom dinim al Yisrael. When there are, chas v'shalom, God forbid, dinim al Yisrael, judgments, terrible, harsh decrees that are unfolding in this world against Klal Yisrael, through dancing and hand clapping, we can sweeten all the judgments. Now we're going to learn, B'ezras Hashem, that very deeply, that the dancing doesn't mean dancing, the clapping doesn't mean clapping. We're going to talk about spiritual activations that are taking place through the spiritual concept of clapping and the spiritual concept of dancing. But at the same time, like the anecdote suggests, it's very literal, right? And we're going to learn that there really isn't any difference between the spiritual activation of what's taking place spiritually and what's taking place physically, something akin to what we learned in Torah Ches about the breathing, right? It's a very real physiological function, that it's true that breathing can give a person an infusion of life and oxygen and energy and vitality. And at the same time, it's just a shadow for something tochen-oriented that a person's supposed to be conscious of while they're doing the experience of breathing. And the same is going to be true here, but it certainly applies to physical dancing and clapping, even though Rebbe Nachman's not really going to be speaking about that so much, but we're going to learn the ma'amak, and we're going to learn the spiritual depth of what it means to clap and what it means to dance. And together, body and soul, that's going to sweeten all the judgments. So how does this work? Says the Rebbe, Ki Iker Geulah Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the ultimate greatness of Hashem, and the ultimate revelation or magnification of Hashem's presence, like we learned in Torah Vav, is Shegama Akum Yedu Sheyesh Elikim Shalut U'Maishal. The ultimate is not that all the Jews should be brought back to Hashem, it's that all the non-Jews should be brought back to Hashem. That every single human should recognize that they were created b'tzelem Elikim, and that our God is not an ethnic Jewish God, is our God, but our God is the God of all humans. All humans. Like Rashi tells us, most people don't know this Rashi, If you look in Rashi on the pasuk Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which on the one hand could seem so particularistic that listen Klal Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, God is our God. Hashem Echad, that God is one. Rashi actually says no. Rashi says what we're really saying is Shema Yisrael, listen Klal Yisrael. We need to always remember and recognize that the essence of our faith is going to lead to a point where this Hashem that is currently only Elokeinu, that is currently by virtue of him being pretty much ignored by the rest of the world, is only our God, Hashem Echad. One day he's going to be the God for all of us united. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So this is the primary godless of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence in the world, and this is where we're headed. Be'ezras Hashem, the non-Jew should also understand that there's only one God who's in control. Kamuva b'Zayar, and this is borne out in the Zayar Kadosh Parshas Yisroi Daf Samach Tesem and Aleph. Karasa Yisroi v'Amar, when Yisroi approached him, having been the chieftain, the ultimate, primary Oved of Adazara, the priest of Midian with all of its Avodazaras, when he approached and he joined together with Klal Yisrael in the Emunah Tahira, Va'amar, and he said, Ki ata yadati ki gadol Hashem, now I know that God is great. Says the Zohar Kadosh, it wasn't that he was saying subjectively, now I know that God is great, but he was saying, Ki ata yadati, now that I know that there's only one HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, Ki gadol Hashem. That causes for there to be, therefore, Ki is therefore, Gadol Hashem. There was a tremendous proliferation of preciousness and elevation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence had in the world, specifically because Yisrael, who was the most distant, drew close, and that manifests the extent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's greatness, just like the greater the light, the deeper into a dark pit it's able to shine. And so that those who are at the bottom of the barrel are awakening and coming close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whether it's Geirim, and I think even deeper, Noahides, right, who stay non-Jews and recognize and accept their role, but they still are accepting HaKadosh Baruch Hu upon them. And there's actually a whole process where they go in front of a Beis Din and they make a declaration. There's an amazing organization called Brit Olam, which I'm in conversation with. I mentioned this, I think, before. And they're doing a lot of work in this regard, and it's incredible what's happening. And Mamish people are joining us. And our Hashem Elokeinu is becoming Hashem Echad. It's Mamish happening. It's really remarkable. So when that happens, that's the great magnification of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light that is quote unquote even able to reach them. Let's try as much as we can to keep this table very steady. Thank you so much. And also good morning and thanks for joining us. He says to the non-Jews, it's impossible for them to know the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yaakov. The only way is through the aspect of Yaakov. As the pasuk says in Yeshayahu, Beis Yaakov lechuvanel chabar Hashem. It is Beis Yaakov. It is through the Geulah of Yaakov Avinu that lechuvanel chabar Hashem, that all the non-Jews are going to be able to walk in the light of Hashem. Now, why Beis Yaakov? Maybe Beis Yitzchak. Or Beis Avram. Why Beis Yaakov? Says the tzaddik ki hu gila elikusa shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu yoser mishar avos. Yaakov Avinu is revealing Hashem's presence in the world even more than Avram and even more than Yitzchak. And this, even though, by the way, we learn from a Maimer Chazal that tells us on the pasuk va'nefesh asher asa b'charan that Avram's whole thing was to be Megayer Geirim. There wasn't Kiruv then because there were no Jews. It was all Geirus, and Rashi tells us Avram was Megayer the men, Sarah was Megayer the women, and we know from the pasuk vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan that Yaakov dwelled in the land of the dwelling of his father. Chazal tell us vayeshev Yaakov, he returned to the avodah of Yitzchak Avinu, which was migurei aviv, which was to make Geirim. So from there we know that Avram made Geirim, Yitzchak made Geirim, and Yaakov made Geirim. But ultimately says Rebbe Nachman, it was Yaakov Avinu whose engagement with the non-Jews was the most potent and the most powerful and the most ultimately effective. And why is this? Says the Gemara Psachim Daf Peches Avram Kari Har. Avram Avinu referred to the mountain of Harabayis as a har, Bahar Yera'eh. right? Bahar Hashem Yira'eh, this place where they were pointed toward to do the Akedah, he called it a mountain. V'Yitzchak Kar Sada, and Yitzchak called this place a field, as the pasuk says, V'Yetzi Yitzchak Lasuach Basada, and that's the aspect of a field, and we know that that's the makam of the Beis Hamikdash. Now says Rebbe Nachman, what's the difference between a mountain and a field? A mountain is very aloof, right? A mountain is very distant, very far. Person has to travel and take pains to train and then climb the mountain, and you only stand a mountain for a short period of time, and then you come down the mountain because you can't even breathe up there, there's no oxygen. But Avram Avinu says God is on a mountain, and the journey toward God is very, very difficult, and God is very distant. Yitzchak calls it a sadeh, and Rebbe Nachman says sadeh hu yoser musag v'nitzrach le'adam mehar. It's closer, it's more accessible. It's not mamish in your place. You still have to go out and you have to make changes to your life in order to discover God. And says the Heilige Rebbe Schusi Agunaleinu v'Kol Yisrael Amen. Yaakov Kar Bayis. Yaakov Avinu says you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to do anything. God is with you now in your home. And this is something that every single human in the whole world could connect to. If they know that they don't have to make a fundamental change, all they have to do is recognize the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in their life, and in so doing, that gives them the capacity to then begin this journey, not far away, but just deeper and deeper and deeper. It isn't out and up, it's in. You just go into the experiences that you are already having. That's a madrega that's shaykh for everybody. And I saw from Rav Shmuel Moshe Kremer in his sefer Mayim Amukim that he says within Klal Yisrael there have also been Avram Avinu Tzadikim and Yitzchak Avinu Tzadikim, meaning within the Emunah Torah of Klal Yisrael, giving us different perceptions of godliness. He says the Baal Shem Tov was unequivocally the Yaakov Avinu Hasaga. That was the Baal Shem. The Baal Shem came to teach you Hashem is in your house. He's in your dining room. He's in your relationships. He's at the office, right? He said Avram Avinu is mamish with, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through the Hasag of Yaakov Avinu, is Hashem is mamish with us every minute. Hainu sheYaakov kras makam abeis hamikdash shu makam atfila bayis shu makam yishuv levnei adam. That's the aspect of a place that's settled for humans. Ki heles atfila, because Yaakov Avinu elevated prayer mehar from the level of the mountain, v'sadeh, and from the level of the field. It's Avram and Yitzchak, and he brought it lebechinas bayis. And is an interesting element where it says he elevated prayer from the mountain to the field to the house, which is a descent. And that little comment I just made is the key to unlock the entire Torah Yud. And so we're going to keep on coming back to that. Okay? Because it turns out that Torah Yud is not about where things are rooted. It's not about where things end up, but it's about where they ultimately are rooted. Because like the Baal Tanya explains, the lower something is, the higher up it reaches. Because it can't shine that deep. The higher a light is rooted, the lower down it reaches. The higher the light ultimately is rooted, like we said, the greatest light is able to shine down to the deepest place. And so Yaakov Avinu, he'eles hatfili, elevated prayer from the mountain to the field to the house, which is a physical descent, but that's just telling you that he elevated the light source and upped it and upped it and upped it, that enabled it to reach down lower and lower and lower. So the physical descent and the aspect of the way that godliness is able to reach seems to be going down, but actually in its supernal source is going up. Keep that in mind if you can as we continue throughout the teaching. Ezra Hashem Yisbarach. Yaakov Avinu elevates prayerful consciousness, like we've been learning, which is the consciousness of Emunah, which is the circular consciousness of believing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashkacha is running the whole world, living with a sense of wonder, and so on. He elevated that experience from only being accessible to people who are mountain climbers, or to those who are able to go out away from the city and to go into the fields, and he brought it down into a person's house. And he says to that aspect of a house the non-Jews are able to relate to. They might not become big, spiritual leaders and priests, but they don't necessarily have to. Am Yisrael are the priesthood nation. We're the ones who are doing the Avodah Gevaya. For them, it's just, they just need to be humans. But they just need to be humans who are conscious. That's it. We don't ask inordinate levels of Kedusha and Precious and whatever. Just conscious experience of humanity. And that's their hasaga. Kamei was the pasuk in Yeshayahu says, Ki beis tefillah, when my aspect of prayer is a house, then yikare l'chol ha'amim. Then it's able to be something that's relevant l'chol ha'amim, and it's specifically when it's a bechina of bias. And then when that happens, then a Kadosh Baruch Hu's presence in the world is magnified. His name is made great in a way that's absolutely incomparable to when the greatest tzaddikim are serving him. Because that's one thing, you grew up in the house of the Chazon Ish, you grew up in the house of the Stipler, whatever. But when a person is mamish, super distant, that it doesn't get more distant. And that person begins to become conscious of Hashem's presence. That brings the greatest elevation to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name. This is the reference to the pasuk in Tehillim, Gadol Hashem Muhulam Ma'od. And there are two psukim that begin this way, right? Gadol Hashem Muhulam Ma'od, V'ligdula say Ein Cheker, but that's not the pasuk being referenced here. This is the pasuk that we say, I believe, on Monday morning in the Shir Shal Yaim, Be'ir Lekeinu Har Kadsha. Says the Rebbe, what does that mean? He says, Gadol Hashem Umuhula Ma'id is a question and an answer. Kalaimar, Gadol Hashem, with a question mark. Emasai Gadol Hashem. When is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name the greatest? When is his name magnified in Olam Hazeh? And the answer is the next two words. Kishehu Muhulal Ma'id. You know what Ma'id is? Say Chazal Tov is a reference to the Yetzer Tov. Tov Ma'od is a reference to the Yetzer Hara. Ma'id is always Misitra D'Maisa. Is always a reference to the extraneous, to the extra, to the non-essential, to the klipa, to the nail, to the hair. Something that isn't the etzem. That's all klipa, that's called motarot. Those are extra things that a person doesn't need. Taivas, right? The opposite of tzaddik, oichel l'seiv v'nafshe, where tzaddik only eats just what they need to keep their body alive. Everything else is klipa. It's the shell. It isn't the thing itself. That's ma'oid. It means extra things. That's a reference to the sitra d'maisa, to the other side, shebechinas akum, which is ultimately, in a certain sense, an aspect, relatively speaking, of the nations of the world. And it was very good. Right? That's a reference to what's fundamentally dead. Unless it really gets an infusion of soul, which is what Klal Yisrael are supposed to be, as the Kuzari tells us. Am Yisrael is the lave, and all the limbs, right, which are pretty darn important if you're talking about a person's body, right? All the other limbs are the nations of the world, right? But Am Yisrael are the lave, but we need the limbs, but the limbs need the heart, and the limbs, klape the heart, are dead, and the heart, klape HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is dead, right? And we need to be connected to Hashem, and the nations of the world need to be connected to Am Yisrael, and in so doing, the whole structure comes to life. And that's ultimately Be'ezras Hashem, where we're going to head one day in a spirit of total humility. Just like, again, I don't get jealous of the Kohanim because I'm a humble Yisraeli, and I never heard of any Levi who's super jealous and said that the Kohanim are so racist and whatever, because Kohanim are Kohanim, Leviim are Leviim, Yisraelim are Yisraelim, and that's just the way it is. It's not better or worse. We just have different roles. And so Am Yisrael are the priests, and the nations of the world are the beneficiaries of our priesthood, and that's just the way it is. And it's not better or worse. It just is. This is the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted it. So the way that the Rebbe is learning this is Gadol Hashem. When is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name the greatest? And the answer is Muhula Ma'od. When the Ma'od are praising him. Kishemuhulal Ma'od. Kishumuhulal Mehem, when he's praised by them, Azayu Gadol. So then, like we said, this is the expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's greatness, Ki Ikar Gedulasai. Because this is the primary greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, if you found that beautiful enough, check this out. The pasuk continues. The Eimasaihu Muhula Mehem. When are the non-Jews able to have a connection to Hashem? And the answer is Be'ir Lekeinu Har Kadshai. Says the Rebbe, when Har Kadshai, which is the hasaga of Avram Avinu, becomes Ir Elekeinu, turns into the hasaga of bias. Be'ir Elekeinu Har Kadshai. When Har Kadshai becomes Ir Elekeinu, then ki beisi based tefillah, then yikar l'chol ha'amim. Tainu kishabachinas har nase ir lekeinu shehu yishuv b'nei adam. When the mountain becomes a city, v'chinas bayish shehu musig yosem mehar v'sada, that's more accessible to people than a mountain and even a field. Tainu kishamalin, again this word, when you elevate as b'chinas hatfila, the aspect of prayer, from it being something that a person can only do once in a million years with the requisite purifications and so on and so forth, meaning the mountain Or even this, that a person needs to be in a particular place, a person needs to be in a Beis HaMedrash, a person needs to be in a shul or a temple or whatever it is, and a person brings it down to bias, which is the Binah, from the standpoint of discussing prayer. That's personal prayer, which is a spodidus, where a person could do this in their bed. Mamish, before you go to sleep, Rebbe Nachman says, pull the covers over your head and talk to Hashem. Right? Or a person's literally in your home, like no matter what, you could just turn to Hashem. Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is literally, truly everywhere, and a person can speak to Him so directly. That's elevating prayer from the mountain to the field and bringing it down to the Bechina of Bayis. And we bring it down into the place, or up to the place, or down to the place, but it's up, therefore it's down, right? Because it's a higher spiritual light, and so it's brighter. It's able to reach the lowest place, Ir Ubayis. Then we bring it down to the Bechina of a city, of a house. Then the non-Jews are able to also have their connection, which is the aspect again of turning the those that are the most distant into people who are aware. And that's the Gadol Hashem when Umuhula Ma'aid be Ir Lekeinu Har Kadshay. When Har Kadshay becomes Ir Lekeinu, then Muhula Ma'aid, and then Gadol Hashem. Again, he reads the whole pasuk, like we've been saying, from the end, and he reads it through all the way to the beginning, which is Rebbe Nachman. It's the Olam Hafach. He's always flipping everything upside down. Az Daika Gadol Hashem. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu is super great. Ki ze Iker Geulah Yisbarach. This is the primary greatness. Kishegam Har Chochmah Yodim Mimani Yisbarach Niskal. I think that this is a remarkable passage. I think it's a singular passage. I challenge anybody to find me in another of the Hasidic Sefer a paragraph like this that speaks so directly to the reality of the non-Jews, and that being a goal, to reach them and to have them in our consciousness and on our mind. I personally have not come across such a clear expression, and I think that it ties into the general Geulah consciousness of Rebbe Nachman that we've been presenting, especially in the PDF that some of the Chavra have, and I was sending around, where we sort of track this consciousness of Geulah. I don't know if anybody had a chance to look at it, from Torah to Torah to Torah, and the magnification of giving Am Yisrael the consciousness we'll need to be able to make it to the finish line of history, which we're literally on the threshold of, and it's it's not stam that these SHIURIM are happening, these limudim are happening. There's a proliferation of this kind of teaching, but in Rebbe Nachman, it's acute. It's very acute if it's very quick. Yeah.
Great teachers teach very, very few people. Even greater, they do
the greatest are able to reach them.
The greatest, even goyim.
Yes, and that's the aspect of the greatest light, right? The deeper the light, the further it's able to reach, and that's the sort of what we're going to be learning here. Mamish, and all the psukim and Navi bear this out, and we've been blind to this issue largely throughout exile, and it's not our fault. It's because they were trying to kill us half the time. Not half the time, maybe 98% of the time. And so we didn't have a very receptive audience, and they weren't throwing tomatoes, they were throwing grenades. So now everything changed, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe felt that after World War II there was a new Metzias, and now he felt we have to start to reach the non-Jews with the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. People mamish don't know, and it's not their fault. It's because where should they know it from? It's not spoken about in yeshivas. It's not, but this is part of the consciousness that needs to unfold. This is Am Yisrael reclaiming our mission. This is us realizing what our identity is as sparks of the divine in this world. What we're really here for. Like what we're actually here for, and what the world can look like. And Hashem, I think, is preparing the technological tools now to be able to reach every single person. You can record a 5-minute shiur in AI, and you can have it translated almost instantly into like 90 languages if you have the proper technology that's continuing to roll out. And it'll even change your mouth to make it look like you're speaking that language. I mean, we're living in wild times, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I think, is putting down the framework both for nuclear Armageddon, and Selu Mazeh, but also the potential to actually mamish to do this work. And so I really think it behooves all of us, Geulah-oriented Yidden, to be thinking in this way and to try to think, how can I get involved, and what does that mean, and what are the parameters, and what are the halachas, and what are the approaches, and it's very important. There's actually a very excellent book, which I'll just make a plug for. I speak about books sometimes, called and His Name Will Be One. It was put out recently by Koren Publishers. It's called Ushmo Echad. It's a translation of that book that was written in Hebrew. And his name will be one, and it's very remarkable, and it lays out many of the different approaches that we're speaking about this topic, and they're not all in concordance one with the other, but it gives you a little bit of an insight into this sugya. Highly, highly recommended, and his name will be one by Koren Publishers. Let's go further.
It looks like the Amos Ha'olam, they know this subconsciously, because you've got Yerushalayim, which is the air Elokim, and you've got all these different. You've got the Christians and the Islam and the Muslims. They're all fighting,
or all settling in that place. Yeah, gorgeous. Got to be the city. It's got to be the Har, which is also a Sada, which is also a Bay.
There's a price to Yidden as well.
Yes.
As well, because I would assume the first step, or not maybe simultaneously, is that the Yidden that feel absolutely rachok right now, as a day's door, also can chat that they're greatest. That's
it. I'm not. So we mentioned. I think that this is the aspect of the Baal Shem Tov's Gilui.
Yes.
The Baal Shem Tov's Gilui is to bring this energy to every single Jew, to realize the hasaga of bias that is Geulah consciousness. As history unfolds, there's a progression of disclosure, and this light becomes revealed deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And sure, we have to reach Yidden, and we have to reach the non-Jews, and both. Okay. The Indian and ourselves, hopefully one day also. The Indian says the Eliger Rebbe, this matter which is to elevate prayer from the level of the mountain to the level of the field to the level of the house, so that it should become a settled place where HaKadosh Baruch Hu can dwell in a person's life. Kadeshi is Gala Malchusai, which is ultimately so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Malchus should be revealed. Gamla Akum, even to the non-Jews, and that's the key, right? That's really what we want. Right? Hashem Echad, Ushmai Echad, the title of that book, is that Hashem's presence will be revealed to all. So they should also have connection to Elokus. And I just want to, again, stress what I mentioned before. You have to put this in the historical context. Who would dare mention the non-Jew? Do you know what kind of pogroms and persecutions? Imagine, we speak about the Palestinians, they're Amalek. We don't understand that October 7th were happening every other week. We don't understand this. It happens to be that, Baruch Hashem, we've had such a period of calm since the Holocaust that it's like egregious by today's standards, and it's ki'ilu adjusted to our standards. If you read the history, a person who's historically sensitive, we compare it to the Holocaust because it's been the biggest massacre since the Holocaust. These things were happening by the week. They were happening by the month. These things were normal occurrences, and they were much worse. They were, much worse, and this was standard Jewish living. So you put Rebbe Nachman's statement and comment in that context. What compassion could you imagine to a person who's talking? Even today, people are like, "What are you talking about the Goyim for?" And Rebbe Nachman is so Geulah oriented. You can imagine why he had opposition, because it was so out of the ordinary to hear a Hasidic Rebbe speaking. It's radical. It's absolutely radical. That we have to recognize that they should also have a hasaga. He says the main thing, the way that's going to happen is through the tzaddikim. How do we know that the tzaddikim have something particularly extraordinary as it relates to prayer? Because the Gemara says in Baba Basar, Dav Kuf Tezayin Amud Aleph, Mi sheyesh lo choyle b'seich beisa yelech etzel chacham v'yivakish levrachamim. A person who has a chas v'shalom, someone in his household who's sick, he should go to a chacham, and the chacham will daven. Says Rebbe Nachman, that's clear from here that ki ikra tefila einam yodim ki im tzaddik adar. The tzaddik adar know how to daven, and we've already learned this in Torah Beis. We learned this in Torah Tes. Right, that tzaddikim have this aspect of knowing where the tefillas go up to the different shvatim, and they're putting up the mishkan. And tzaddikim know how to daven. And somebody asked, "What are you talking about? That a person should go to tzaddik? You shouldn't daven yourself, right? Why shouldn't you daven yourself?" And we're going to learn in a minute. Rebbe Nachman's going to really go on a bit of a rant about those who don't believe that tzaddikim have a greater capacity to daven than they do. But aren't we supposed to daven ourselves? I think it's a very sweet, and I think maybe a very real diuk. I mean, look at the pasuk. Look at the Gemara. The Gemara is telling us that avada, a person is supposed to daven themselves. Mi sheyesh lo choyle b'soich beisai. He's been davening. Beisai is basically based tefillah. He's been davening, but he still has a chayla b'seich beisai. His tefillah isn't working. Then yelech etzel chacham. Then you go to a tzaddik v'vakish levrachamim. It's a little humble diak. The tzaddikim are the ones who really are the masters of prayer. And here the Rebbe says, Ki yesh bali gaiva, and he calls it out. He says, at the end of the day, it's arrogance. They don't believe in going to tzaddikim. And they say, I don't need to go to a tzaddik. The Gemara says, go to a tzaddik, but they don't, that particular Gemara, they're not so fond of. They don't believe that you should go to tzaddikim to daven. They say, I can daven myself. And not only that, but the Rebbe says, maybe infinitely worse, and they prevent other people who want to travel to tzaddikim, and it's amalek, right? Essentially, it's kriris, asher karcha baderech. They're on the journey to tzaddikim, and there are those that come and cool them off and say, don't go, what's the point? Aleim Nemar, about those people, the pasuk says in Bereshis, Hashev Eishes Ha'ish, HaKadosh Baruch Hu talking to Avimelech, saying, return Sarai, return Sarah, Avram Avinu's wife, Hashev Eishes Ha'ish, return the wife of this man. And the pasuk continues, which Rebbe Nachman doesn't bring, but it's so obvious that it's relevant to this teaching because it's literally in that context. But the Rebbe isn't here to prove that he's right. He's just here to give us the most essential ingredients for the cake. The rest you figure out yourself. But if you read the pasuk further, the pasuk continues, Ki Navihu Yispalo Ma'adach, because he's a prophet and he will pray for you, because Abimelech had been struck with all kinds of illness, and he will pray and you'll get free. Rebbe Nachman doesn't even make reference to that. He just looks at these three words, Hashev Eishes Ha'ish. Why is this relevant to a person who doesn't believe that tefillah should be given to the tzaddikim to daven? Says the Rebbe, you know why? Ki zeh bal gaiva mechuna b'lashen Avimelech. We can accurately call this particular Baal Gaiva, we can call him Avimelech, right? And again, we should turn it always inside, like somebody really pointed out very, very properly when I was speaking about Misnagdim, and she sent me a message, and she's right. She said the inner Misnagid, so we're speaking, it's not so nice to say on external Misnagdim. We all have a Misnagid inside. We all have a Baal Gaiva inside that's preventing us from going to tzaddikim, saying, I could daven. So that's much more na'im, to sort of reflect it inward, and I thank her for that. But this is the aspect of Avimelech. Why is it Avimelech? Because Avi means Lashon Ratzon, to desire, like Va'avisa Tehila, right? Or V'loi Ava, different psukim, right? That refer to wanting as the pasuk of, which means to desire. So Avi Melech, Ki Hu Ratzon Limlech. He wants to be the tzaddik. Avi Melech. He wants to be the king. So V'hainu Avi Melech. So the truth is that a tzaddik is moshel in his prayer. And Yerusalem we know his prayer. The tzaddik has memshala. The tzaddik is capable of davening. And this person says, I don't need to go to the tzaddik. I can daven myself. I myself will daven, and I'm not going to connect myself to the anshe shleimenu of the tzaddik, right? Who's a neshama klalis, where in all the nation, the particular data points of Klal Yisrael are collected into this algorithmic cloud. I don't want that. I want to stand alone. I want to stand apart, which we know kabbalistically we spoke about on Shabbos, called shvir sakelim, right? When each of the vessels in and of itself said, Ana emlech, I want to be the main one. It doesn't work like that, right? It doesn't work like that. All of the people need to be in a collaborative effort, bound up through the tzaddikim and brought close to Hashem. Is that Perish? And that's Pshat, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells this Baal Gaiva, this Avi Melech, he says, Hashev Eishes Ha'ish, return Eishes Ha'ish, return this. What's Eishes? Eishes is Rosh Tevis, Adni Sefasai Tiftach. It's a reference to prayer. So you, Avi Melech, you want to daven on your own? Avi Limlech. As he says, do me a favor. Hashev Eishes Ha'ish. Return prayer. It's not yours. Give it to the tzaddik. Ze bechinas tefillah. Dahainu Hashev Eishes. Bechinas ha-tefillah la-tzaddik. To the tzaddik. So he does make reference to the next three words, but he leaves out v'yispal ba'adach, and instead he makes a drush on the word navi, which is shocking. But he says ki navihu, because he's a navi. What is navi? Ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu mesavel l'tfilasin shel tzaddikim. We know HaKadosh Baruch Hu desires the prayer of the tzaddikim, as the Gemara in Chulin tells us, and therefore umeshager tefillah sidur b'fiv kadei sheyahanim tfilasai. He enables the tzaddik to daven with a very clear expression. V'zeu ki navihu is lashon niv svasayim. Navihu. He's a navi. He can pray fluently. The tzaddik can pray fluently. So return Eishes Ha'ish. Ki navihu, because he knows how to daven. Right? He knew that if his prayer was fluent, then his prayer would be answered. If it wasn't fluent, it wouldn't be answered. And then Rebbe Nachman leaves out the next two words, right, which is literally the Yispalel Ba'adach. It's mamish, an overt reference to prayer, and he leaves that out. He says, V'chulu, V'zeh Hashev. And Hashev, Rashi Tevis, can't make this stuff up, Har Sada Bayis. Hashev. Return the prayer to the tzaddik. You know why? Because the tzaddik is capable of elevating tefillah from the har to the sada to the bayis. Hashev eshes ha'ish ki navihu v'yispal ba'adach. Ze remez sha'at tefillas ha'tzadik hu b'shlemus. The tzaddik's prayer is b'shlemus, and that's why you should return the tefillah to the tzaddik. Shemal oisay be'bechinas har v'sada le'bechinas bayis, because he's elevating this prayer from the level of mountain to the level of field to the level of home. Aval, says Rebbe Nachman, however, Eila baligaiva. These people who are preventing the tzaddikim from davening are actually, it's a terrible thing to think about, are withholding the taiva of Hashem. Imagine that. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants nothing more than the tzaddik to daven. And people that are fighting against tzaddikim are preventing other people from going to tzaddikim, and the tzaddik should daven for them. Hashem is like starving, kiviyachal, Hashem is hungry. And we're holding up the waiter. Like the waiter's like on his way to the table to bring him food, and you're holding up the waiter, and that's holding back Hashem's taiva. They don't ask the tzaddikim to pray for them because they think they'll do it themselves. They'll fast and they'll go through sigufim and that's it. It's like a formula. You tick the boxes and boom, you're a tzaddik. Because you look like a tzaddik and you act like a tzaddik. But it says Rebbe Nachman, that's not quite it. But that's not it. That's not how it goes. All this fast, he says, he says that's like a sackcloth that has a lot of holes, and you think, oh, okay, this sack has lots of holes. Got to get rid of the holes. I guess I'll wash it. And they're washing the sack to get rid of the holes. You can't get rid of holes by washing it. He says you can fast all you like, but there are holes in a person's neshama that are essential, that aren't healed as easily as just following the formula to be a tzaddik. It doesn't work that way.
What does the washing mean?
The washing in this context is fasting. He's washing his body out, right? Fasting, withholding from eating. That's the reference over here. Let's let him unfold it. Yeah. Va'aguf nikra sak. And the body is called a sak. As the Tana says, Shinana Shrei Sakach. Remove your body. The sak in that context is talking about a body. And if they would really be misboinin in themselves, HaYuRim, they would find, and this is the Balatani's Beinani, that even though it looks like they're a tzaddik because they're not doing any averis, but they'll find they still have all the taivas that everybody else has, and that's where it's at. Meaning it isn't just the fact, and again, this is not the Rebbe Nachman that we've seen, in other places. This is sharp Rebbe Nachman. This is not the Bechina of Shoiv. This is the Bechina of Ratzah, right? Mamish. This is Ratzah. Rebbe Nachman is saying, what? Who do you think? Well, because now you didn't do any averes in the last year. Now you're a big tzaddik. Rebbe Nachman says, what? You think God? Now you know what God is. Look inside of yourself. You see, you still have all the taivas. Just your white knuckling. That's not called a tzaddik. Rebbe Nachman says that's not called a tzaddik. HaYuRim, they would see achar kol atanisim adai nisharu atzlam kol tavasim kshura b'sakam. All of their taivas are still in their body. They didn't get rid of any taiva, so they just holding themselves back. But they didn't heal. So they healed the symptom, but they didn't heal the root cause. And the Rebbe is always about the root cause. He doesn't want to hear about symptoms. He wants to know that we're dealing with the actual issue at its shirish. So you can fast all you want, and it will weaken the body, and a person will be. But inside, the person's not there. And they're not there. It's still in their body. And not only did their actual taiva is with them, their taiva, right? Like they haven't even healed this, that sheyesh etzla mishas hayulada. The Rebbe Nachman says in Sichos Rana, the Balatanya says, right, that a person who is not having holy thoughts during hayulada, that can produce that within the child comes this taiva. And it's not the child's fault, right? It's a residue of the parents' taiva, b'shas helada, and that's also something that we have to work on, which in modern terms is not only our own trauma, but we're working on generational trauma, right? And there are things that are passed along, right? And there are things that are our own, and there are things that are inherited. So like this person hasn't even begun. Not only didn't he get rid of he didn't get rid of his own. That's one thing, but he didn't even get rid of the residue that's not even his. Right? Because of this, that the parent wasn't purifying himself at the shas zivug, which again isn't the child's fault. That's part of the hashkach aliyah, that a baby is born in the way that a baby is born, and that's exactly the right. Meaning there's no right or wrong. That's just the way that a child is born, and that's okay. But that's a reality. This is still in their bodies also. If they would see this, oh boy, he says, it would be apparent to them, like, oh, I didn't even start. They would see mamish, they're on the madrega, on a very, very, very low madrega. Now here in the Torah, we've just seen the saga of Shoiv very strongly, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was able to come down into the bias of the biggest Rishayim, and the people are the most distant, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with them, and that's the revelation. Yishgalu Malchusai, Hashem's presence is revealed even on the low levels. And then Rebbe Nachman sort of says, in order to get Shoiv out there, you need tzaddikim who are rooted in the Nekud Al-Yain of the Aleph, in the Bechina of Ratzai, right? And we haven't seen any expression of Ratzai as sharp, I don't think, in Likutei Moharan so far, as this. And you see, Rebbe Nachman gives both, because he has that balance. Says, and this is reminding me, just very briefly, I have 2 minutes left, very briefly, it's reminding me of the story of Reb Tzaddik HaKohen, without getting into the background now, about why he was traveling all throughout Europe. He was seeking a heter me'Rabbanan. Very, very tragic, terrible, terrible story. Hashem Yishmar Aleinu. And one of the tzaddikim told him that if he does this, he's not going to have children, and he didn't have children. But Reb Tzaddik went from Rav to Rav to Rav to Rav. He was a big misnagid. Tzaddik was a litvak shein kamayu. He was not a chassid at all, and he was already renowned as a goyin adir. Tzaddik was a goyin oilam. And along his journeys, he had to spend Shabbos in Ishbitz. If anybody knows the story, by the Mea Shilach, or Mordechai Yosef Leiner, who had recently broken off from his Rebbe, the Kutzker, which itself is a whole fascinating story. These are very amazing, amazing stories in Jewish history. And Rebbe Tzaddik spent Shabbos there, and the story goes, the Friday night he didn't want to participate at all in any of the going-ons and the tish, and he's sitting in the back with his Baba Kama, he's not interested. And Shabbos morning, also the Kiddush, nothing. He's just there for a very specific purpose. Or Mordechai Yosef is a tzaddik, but it's not his derech at all. And the story goes that Shalosh Shudas, it's pitch black in the room, and Mordechai Yosef is sharing Torah. And all of a sudden, from the back of this dark room, there's like a howl. The story is told like a primal geschrei, like a cry. And they hear Tzaddik HaKohen screaming, "The Rebbe's pouring acid on my soul. The Rebbe's pouring acid on my neshama." And to me, again, I'm sure Tzaddik was a perfect Tzaddik before this, but in a certain sense, that construct is something like what Rebbe Nachman's describing here. Where like a person, like Charada Geulah Hayanaif Alem, like, oh my gosh, a person's introduced to it. Like I thought I was good with Yiddishkeit, and then the Baal Shem Tov came into my life, and all of a sudden I'm like, I don't even know what. Like the Ar Madrigas at Aiden, we were speaking about it yesterday, don't stay stuck. It's like people, they think, yeah, this is davening, and I daven. But like, do you know how many Madrigas there are to davening? Like this is not, Shabbos. We keep Shabbos. You learn the halachas Shabbos, keep Shabbos. Shabbos. Right? How many infinite madrigas there are? There's avoida in this world. Avoida ben adam l'chaveira. Madrigas. And that can confound a person. It's also very exciting, but it's also, it can be painful. It could be painful, So let's finish up. As a Perish, see, he wants to say, this is Pshat in the Psukim, by Yosef HaTzadik and the Shvatim. When at the end, right, or really at the beginning, Yosef had told them to put all of the money that they had paid for all the grain, put it back in their sack. Vayihe Marikim Sakem, the pasuk says that they were emptying out their sack. V'ini Ishtzar Kaspe B'Sakoi, and they each found their money in their sack. Says the Rebbe, well, we already said a sack is a body. Achar Kol HaTanisim, after all of the fast, Shua Rakas HaSak, that's emptying out the sack, cleaning out the sack, B'chinas Haguf, Adayin V'ini Ishtzar Kaspe B'Sakoi. Kaspe is Shekasher Ritzar Kasva kisufin v'tavasai b'saka v'gufay. They emptied out the sack, and their kesef, their kisufin, their taivas is still in the sack because it's a hole. Vayuris teres kaspeim, and they saw their own kesef, their own kisufin in the sack. Not only theirs, hema ve'avien, theirs and their dads. I mean, come on, for this alone. If Rebbe Nachman said nothing else in the sefer but this page, do you hear Torah like this? I mean, hey, Marikan Sakem, it is char kaspe b'sakoi, vayuru as chars kaspeim, hema ve'avim, hainu loy dai chars kaspeim. It's not enough that their own kisufin is tied to the sack, shu taivas atzman, ki im gam hema ve'avim, hainu atayvas shal avim, which is shocking in context because it's talking about Yaakov Avinu and the Shvatim. I'm trying to explain to you the level of the hasaga of Ratzai, of Ayim Ekrim Kavod Rebbe Nachman is discussing here. Like he's saying it would even theoretically apply to the Shvatim and Yaakov because the Madrigas are infinite. And Yaakov Avinu also, he wasn't perfect. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't perfect. There are always higher Madrigas, right? Like we learned in Esak Shamayim, still Shamata. Gam Hemaloi Naflu Mehem. Vezehu Vayirau. And then they freaked out. Because that's a very shocking experience when a person comes into the contact of a true tzaddik and they thought they had reached whatever madrigas they thought they reached, and then it's like, wow, there's a whole new dimension of Yiddishkeit. I haven't even begun. And then they're like, yeah, I don't think I'm a tzaddik anymore. And I'm not Avimelech. I've returned Hashiv Eishas Ish, Har Sad Bayis, Adni Sofasaitivta, Ki Navihu, Viespal Ba'adach, Be'ezras Hashem, to be continued tomorrow morning. Ashreinu, Ashreinu, Ashreinu. Asher Kach. Thank you so much.